Welcome, you deep divers, to the ultimate high-speed review session.
Uh-huh.
If you are listening to this right now, chances are you are staring down the barrel of a high-stakes AP US history exam tomorrow morning.
And you need a plan.
You need a chronological shot of pure, unadulterated, FRQ-ready knowledge.
And that is precisely our mission today. We are not just giving you the textbook summary.
No.
We are tearing through all 9 periods from 1491 to the present, focusing intensely on the key historical thinking skills that drive those free response questions.
Causation, comparison, and change over time.
Exactly. Our goal is to connect the turning points and provide you with the specific details, the laws, the names, the vocabulary. That makes an essay score highly.
We're talking about a marathon review. We have to move quickly, but thoroughly, hitting the concepts weighted most heavily on the exam.
And we'll move chronologically, starting with the pre-contact world of 1491.
All the way through revolutions, civil war, world wars, and straight into the economic and cultural challenges of the 21st century.
So let's just dive right in. Period 1.
Let's do it.
Okay, starting with period 1, 1491 to 1607.
The very beginning.
Right. And although this is the shortest and least weighted period on the exam...
It's only about 4–6%.
Exactly. But its concepts are absolutely foundational, especially for understanding comparison and causation related to the environment and, of course, European contact.
Okay, let's unpack this with a focus on Native American societies.
Yeah.
The comparison skill is crucial here because life in North America was... it was tremendously varied.
And it was driven almost entirely by geography and adaptation.
Right.
The single most important adaptation concept you need to know is the significance of maize cultivation.
Corn.
It spread north from Mesoamerica, supported permanent settlement, it allowed for social diversification, and it led to large-scale economic development.
So you have examples of that.
Oh, absolutely. For example, in the arid Southwest, groups like the Hohokam developed these incredibly advanced irrigation systems, elaborate canals, just to support their agriculture.
And that's what allowed them to settle permanently in what's otherwise a really challenging environment.
Exactly. And that adaptation changes dramatically based on location.
For sure. If you look at the Great Basin and the Western Great Plains, the environment was highly arid, resources were sparse.
So that dictated a largely mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle.
Because settlement just wasn't feasible.
Right. But then you contrast that with the settled mixed agricultural economies of the Northeast.
Totally different world.
In the Northeast, you have groups like the Iroquois Confederacy, and they're relying on Three Sisters agriculture.
Corn, beans, and squash.
The classics. And that allowed them to live in permanent longhouses and create these really complex political structures.
And then way out on the Pacific coast, you get hyper-specialization.
Right. The Chinook relied on the massive salmon runs, which led to a highly stratified, non-egalitarian social structure.
And the Chumash. They built these sophisticated plank-built canoes called tumals.
Which they use for long-distance trade. It just demonstrates this complex seafaring technology that developed completely independently.
So the moment of contact is where causation really takes over. European motivations, the 3 Gs, that's a slam dunk for any essay.
Gold, glory, and God. But we need to look a little deeper into the economic forces. The consolidation of power in nations like, Spain and Portugal, it meant that state-driven mercantilism fueled exploration.
And this leads to a critical comparison you need to make. Funding models.
Yes. Spanish colonization was centrally managed, it was state-driven, and it was all based on mercantilism.
Which is the concept that the world's wealth, gold, and silver was finite. So the goal was to get a favorable balance of trade.
Exactly. Now, later, nations like England, they shifted toward privatized joint stock companies.
And these companies pooled investor resources, which spread out the risk.
And that greatly increased the volume and the speed of settlement efforts in the next century. It's a huge change.
Okay, so focusing specifically on the Spanish system, they relied on the encomienda system.
Which was forced labor justified on religious grounds.
And they had a legal document for this. Their requerimiento.
Which is just wild to think about. They would read it to native populations, claiming the Pope granted the Spanish monarchs authority over them.
So the document essentially put the burden of resistance on the victim.
It did. It argued that if natives resisted conversion or Spanish rule, they forfeited the crown's protection and could be subjugated or killed legally.
A terrifying legal tool.
It was. And that brutality fueled this intense internal debate back in Spain, which is fantastic material for an FRQ on context or comparison.
So you had Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda on one side.
Right, who argued fiercely for native inferiority and justified conquest.
And on the other side.
Bartolomé de las Casas, a priest who witnessed the atrocities and defended native dignity. He argued that brutalization was completely counterproductive to their goal of salvation.
And that debate actually led to some changes, right?
It led to the new laws of 1542, which tried to curtail the worst abuses, but colonial resistance made them really difficult to enforce.
And let's not forget native resistance.
Absolutely not. The massive depopulation of the Taíno due to disease, enslavement, and the suppression of the 1495 Taíno Rebellion is a heartbreaking early example.
But the key resistance event for your exam
Has to be the Pueblo Revolt of 1680.
Right.
The Pueblo people temporarily expelled the Spanish from New Mexico, believing the Spanish Christ was responsible for their drought and strife.
And the long-term consequence was huge.
It was, because when the Spanish eventually reconquered the area, they were forced into a much more accommodating relationship with the Pueblo. They had to respect their customs more.
Okay, moving into period 2, 1607 to 1754. This covers the founding of Jamestown all the way to the start of the French and Indian War.
A very highly weighted period. It's focused on British regional differences and the evolution of labor system.
And that's the key, the transition to slavery.
Exactly. But first, the British colonization pattern was immediately distinguishable from the Spanish.
How so?
The British were motivated by a more diverse set of factors. Permanent residence, for one. They mixed economic opportunity like Jamestown's search for gold and the tobacco boom that followed.
Was religious freedom, like the Puritans seeking a city upon a hill in New England.
And they established institutions of political autonomy much, much earlier.
Like the Virginia House of Burgesses.
And the New England town meetings. That's a huge difference.
Which leads us directly to the critical comparison point. Regional differences.
You have to be able to contrast the three main regions for the exam.
Okay, let's do it. New England first.
Settled by Puritan families, they're focused on subsistence farming, trade, and shipbuilding. It creates a tight-knit, relatively egalitarian society.
With decentralized political participation through those town meetings you mentioned.
Right. Then you have the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania.
The breadbasket colony.
Breadbasket colonies. Incredibly diverse, building an export economy on cereal crops.
And they promoted religious and ethnic tolerance, heavily influenced by the Quakers in Pennsylvania.
For sure. Finally, the Chesapeake and Southern colonies.
These were focused almost entirely on highly labor-intensive cash crops.
Tobacco and rice. And they initially relied heavily on white indentured servants.
And this reliance is what leads directly to a crucial causation story.
The transition to chattel slavery.
And Bacon's rebellion in 1676 is the pivot point you must know.
Absolutely. This was an uprising of angry, often landless farmers and indentured servants who resented the elite planters' policies and their lack of protection against native attacks in Virginia.
And the key consequence of that rebellion.
Elite planters became terrified of relying on a large, armed, but politically disenfranchised white labor force. They were a threat.
So they strategically pivoted.
They pivoted hard, pushing heavily toward African chattel slavery as a more controllable, permanent, and crucially, an easily racialized labor source.
And this solidified chattel slavery as this brutal hereditary system.
Where enslaved persons were defined as personal property, stripped of all rights, and it was reinforced by these incredibly harsh laws like prohibiting weapon possession or giving owners the legal right to kill for disobedience.
When you're looking at demographics for an essay, you always have to note the comparison.
Always. While slavery existed everywhere, small New England farms used relatively few enslaved people.
But the numbers surged in the Chesapeake and Southern colonies for plantation agriculture.
Right. But remember, the greatest concentration of enslaved Africans ended up in the British West Indies, driven by the astronomical demands of the sugar economy.
And resistance was ever present.
It was. You see covert resistance through the preservation of cultural customs, languages, naming practices, just maintaining personhood in the face of dehumanization.
And then there was overt resistance.
Like the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739. Enslaved men stole weapons and attempted to march to freedom in Spanish Florida.
Which showed an unequivocal rejection of subjugation, forcing brutal crackdowns by the colonial authorities.
And this all links to the global economy. The Atlantic economy exchanged goods, enslaved persons, and American Indians.
And the British government, operating under mercantilist goals, enforced the Navigation Acts.
These were laws requiring colonies to trade primarily with Britain. It's all about that favorable balance of trade.
However, Britain often employed a policy known as salutary neglect.
Yeah, where these laws were only erratically enforced.
And that period of neglect is so important.
It's critical because it allowed the colonies to develop significant political autonomy and economic self-sufficiency, which becomes a major source of conflict when Britain tries to end this policy after 1763.
We also have major cultural and intellectual shifts happening here.
Right. The consumer revolution, fueled by new access to manufactured goods from Britain, it shifted societal status away from old family pedigree.
And toward financial success and the ability to consume.
Exactly. And intellectually, the Enlightenment introduced John Locke's ideas of natural rights.
Life, liberty, and property granted by a creator.
And the social contract, which stipulated that governments ruled only by the consent of the governed.
The religious counterpart to that was the Great Awakening.
A massive spiritual revival. You need to know two names here. Jonathan Edwards, who combined rational argument with emotional fervor.
And George Whitefield, whose traveling sermons fostered intercolonial unity and religious excitement.
And this movement was politically significant. The New Light preachers encouraged followers to question established, wealthy colonial authority.
Providing, as the book says, biblical ballast, a religious precedent for later political resistance against the crown.
That's the perfect way to put it.
Okay, we jump into the imperial crisis and nation building. Period 3, 1754 to 1800. This is the revolution and the creation of the Constitution.
And the initial spark was the 7 Years' War.
Also known as the French and Indian War.
Right, and the causation here is crystal clear. The war, fought over control of the Ohio River Valley, was cripplingly expensive for Britain.
It doubled their national debt.
It doubled their debt and quintupled the cost of running the colonies. This massive financial pressure was the direct cause for the end of salutary neglect.
Britain desperately needed revenue and to assert imperial control.
So you get George Grenville's plan, which seeks to clamp down.
Stricter enforcement of the Navigation Acts, new direct revenue taxes like the Stamp Act.
And the Quartering Act of 1765. And colonial resistance immediately coalesced around the concept of taxation without representation.
And this is a great comparison moment for an essay.
It is. Colonists argued for actual representation, the right to elect representatives who would advocate for their specific colonial interests.
But the British countered with virtual representation.
Which was the idea that Parliament represented the interests of all British subjects, even those across the Atlantic.
And that fundamental disagreement made compromise nearly impossible.
Exactly. Resistance was both physical boycotts, the Sons of Liberty and the Boston Tea Party, the Daughters of Liberty supporting local production,
and literary. John Dickinson's letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania argued eloquently against Parliament's right to tax.
And that set the intellectual stage for the formal declarations that followed.
The philosophical foundations of the revolution must be mastered.
Absolutely. Thomas Paine's common sense was critical. It was an accessible, powerful critique of monarchy and a call for republican government. It radicalized public opinion across social classes.
And then came the Declaration of Independence,
which formally declared separation and asserted those Enlightenment ideals of natural rights and self-governance.
The victory in the revolution was, truly improbable.
It really was. Britain had overwhelming military, financial, and logistical advantages. The Continental Army was a ragtag operation.
So what were the key factors for the American victory?
George Washington's strategic brilliance, knowing when not to fight, using a war of attrition.
Colonial resilience.
And, critically, the key foreign alliances, particularly the French alliance after the pivotal victory at Saratoga.
When discussing the revolution, you have to address the paradox of slavery.
You must. The rhetoric of natural rights often seemed hollow, yet it provided a legal and moral language for abolitionists.
Free black leaders like Prince Hall used the revolution's rhetoric in their 1777 Freedom Petition to the Massachusetts legislature,
demanding equality based on those same natural rights. This tension over liberty and bondage defines the entire early republic.
So after the war, the first attempt at government was the Articles of Confederation.
And the framers, just terrified of central tyranny, created a government that was deliberately weak.
It lacked a strong executive, a federal army, or the power to tax.
And the result was financial chaos and political paralysis.
And the crisis of Shays' Rebellion, where the federal government was powerless to help Massachusetts suppress debt-ridden farmers, proved the Articles were a failure.
Right, it was the final nail in the coffin.
The only lasting success of the Articles
was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It provided an orderly process for future statehood and, crucially, prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory.
That stability for future expansion was critical, but it wasn't enough to save the system.
Not at all. So the Constitutional Convention was necessary.
And the Constitution was a product of intense negotiation and compromise. You have to remember the three big ones.
First, the Great Compromise. It created the bicameral legislature. House based on population, Senate based on equal state representation.
Second, the Three-Fifths Compromise, which counted enslaved people for representation purposes, artificially inflating Southern political power.
And beyond the compromises, you have to understand the structure. Federalism is the sharing of power between the national and state governments.
The Supremacy Clause means national law generally trumps state law in enumerated powers.
But the 10th Amendment reserves all other powers for the states.
And then separation of powers and checks and balances, based on Montesquieu's theory, designed explicitly to prevent the rise of tyranny.
Exactly.
The shaping of the Republic immediately led to the development of the first-party system.
Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, who championed a strong central government, the national bank, and manufacturing.
Versus the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who favored states' rights, a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and the agrarian ideal.
And George Washington, in his farewell address, explicitly warned against the dangers of permanent foreign alliances and the rise of these political factions.
Early foreign policy issues tested the new government.
Pinckney's treaty secured vital access to the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans for Western farmers.
The XYZ affair, where French agents demanded a bribe, heightened anti-French sentiment.
And domestically, native policy under the federal government consistently sided with settlers over preventing conflict, using the Indian Intercourse Act and deploying forces in scorched earth campaigns.
The final test of legitimacy was the Whiskey Rebellion.
Right. Washington personally led troops to suppress resistance against the federal excise tax on whiskey.
And this demonstrated the immense power and legitimacy of the new Constitution.
Providing a crucial contrast to the impotence shown during Shays' Rebellion under the Articles. It proved this new government had teeth.
Okay, we enter the age of Jefferson, nationalism, and reform. Period 4, 1800 to 1848.
This era is defined by the expansion of democracy and the rise of sectional tensions that lead right up to the Civil War.
It starts with the Revolution of 1800.
The first peaceful transfer of power between opposing national parties, it set a massive precedent for democratic stability.
Early judicial expansion occurred with Marbury v. Madison,
which established the critical principle of judicial review, the Supreme Court's power to declare acts unconstitutional.
a huge expansion of judicial power,
Huge. Then came the Louisiana Purchase.
which really challenged Jefferson's strict constructionism.
It did. The belief that the government could only do what the Constitution explicitly allowed was severely tested. He ultimately justified the purchase by citing the greater national good
Land for expansion, securing access to the Mississippi,
and greatly reducing European influence in North America.
asserting a global presence was also critical in this period.
The Barbary Wars established the U.S. as willing to use military force overseas to protect its trading rights.
The War of 1812 cemented national unity and fueled a massive surge of nationalism, while also leading to the final demise of the Federalist Party.
And this period culminates in the Monroe Doctrine, declaring the entire Western Hemisphere off-limits to future European colonization or intervention.
And this is where the economic structure of the country changes fundamentally.
The market revolution. This is a huge causation point for any essay.
So you have innovations like Slater's textile mill, interchangeable parts, and the telegraph.
Driving unprecedented industrial growth, and critically, transportation infrastructure. The Erie Canal and the expansion of railroads linked the North and the Midwest economically.
Much more tightly than they linked regions in the South.
And that caused a decisive shift away from subsistence farming toward commercial agriculture.
This industrialization drove regional specialization, a key comparison point.
You've got the North focusing on industry, wage labor, and immigration.
The Midwest becomes the grain and livestock producer.
And the South, meanwhile, experienced a massive cotton boom fueled by the cotton gin, which dramatically expanded the demand for and reliance on plantation slavery.
But the economies were still interconnected?
Oh, absolutely. Northern banks and shipping were financially dependent on Southern cotton exports.
Politically, we saw an expanding democracy.
The elimination of property qualifications for voting led to universal white male suffrage, driven by laboring men, frontier settlers, and economic crises like the Panic of 1819.
This new, energized electorate led to the formation of new parties,
Democrats, led by Jackson, favoring states' rights and strict instruction.
versus the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, favoring federal action, loose construction, and the American system.
Which was tariffs, infrastructure, and a national bank.
Andrew Jackson's use of federal power is critical for your essays.
It is. In the bank war, he vetoed the recharter of the Second Bank, calling it a hydra of corruption that only benefited the elite, demonstrating presidential power.
And then in the nullification crisis.
When South Carolina, led by Calhoun, attempted to nullify the federal tariff, Jackson responded with the Force Bill, asserting federal supremacy. He nearly triggered a civil war.
However, Jackson wielded that same federal power against native sovereignty.
He did. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 forced tribal groups westward.
And even though the Cherokee won their case in the Supreme Court, Worcester v. Georgia in 1832.
Jackson famously defied the ruling, which resulted in the brutal forced migration known as the Trail of Tears. It just shows the hypocrisy of federal power.
This era was also the age of reform, largely fueled by the Second Great Awakening.
This revival emphasized moral perfection, individualism, and inclusivity. Camp meetings were common, and it fostered the growth of politically active groups like the AME Church, founded by Richard Allen.
And this evangelical fervor spurred massive reform movements.
Right, aimed at creating a more moral republic. Think temperance, utopian communities like the Shakers and Oneida, and of course, abolitionism.
When you write about abolition, be sure to contrast William Lloyd Garrison,
who advocated immediate moral persuasion and rejected violence,
with Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave and powerful orator who published his narrative emphasizing the psychological and physical dehumanization of slavery.
A perfect contrast. And all these movements culminated in the women's rights movement, sparked by the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848.
Which issued the Declaration of Sentiments explicitly asserting that all men and women are created equal, borrowing the language of the Declaration of Independence to demand suffrage and legal equality.
A radical statement for its time.
Okay, period 5. This covers Manifest Destiny, the collapse of compromise, the Civil War, and the subsequent failure of Reconstruction.
1844 to 1877. This is arguably the most central period for any AP-USH exam.
It starts with Manifest Destiny, a term coined by John L. O'Sullivan.
And it was the core idea that the U.S. was compelled to expand its borders westward, driven by divine right and a sense of American exceptionalism.
The motivations were varied. Mineral resources like the gold and silver rushes.
Economic opportunity for people like Luzina Wilson in frontier towns.
And religious refuge, like the Mormon migration to Utah.
And President James K. Polk aggressively advanced this. He provoked the Mexican-American War and acquired the massive Mexican cession through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
And the immediate fallout of that acquisition is what ignites the sectional crisis.
Intense controversy over whether slavery would be permitted in these new Western lands.
The Wilmot Proviso attempted to ban slavery in these new territories.
And though it failed to pass, its very existence highlighted the growing tension.
And critically, Frederick Douglass opposed the war entirely, seeing it as a plot orchestrated by slave power to expand the area of bondage.
Right. So the Compromise of 1850 was a temporary fix, a Band-Aid.
Its concession to the South, the Strengthened Fugitive Slave Act, was a moral catastrophe.
It radicalized Northerners who were now compelled by federal law to participate in the enforcement of slavery.
And the note's concession was the admission of California as a free state.
But that truce collapsed with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854,
which repealed the Missouri Compromise by introducing popular sovereignty,
allowing settlers to decide the issue of slavery for themselves. This immediately led to violence in Bleeding, Kansas, a localized civil war.
Then came the judicial failure with the Dred Scott decision in 1857.
The Supreme Court ruled that black people were not citizens and had no rights that the white man was bound to respect.
Crucially, it also ruled that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories,
which effectively validated the Southern position and convinced many Northerners that slave power controlled the federal government entirely.
This political crisis led to the collapse of the Whig Party
and the rise of the Republican Party, whose core goal was to stop the expansion of slavery.
Lincoln's election in 1860, despite receiving less than 40% of the popular vote, triggered secession.
And the Confederate motivation was clear. Vice President Alexander Stephens's cornerstone speech affirmed that the Confederacy was founded upon the explicit Great Truth, of racial inequality and the subordination of the African race.
So the Civil War followed. What were the Union advantages?
Overwhelming. 4 times the Confederacy's population, 70% of the railroads, industrial superiority, and naval dominance with the Anaconda Plan.
And the Union goal shifted over time.
It did. Initially, it was just preserving the Union, but after 1863, it definitively shifted to include ending slavery.
The Emancipation Proclamation was a brilliant strategic move.
It was. It freed slaves only in rebellious states, transforming the conflict into a moral crusade against slavery.
Which eliminated any hope of European diplomatic support for the South.
And it encouraged African American enlistment. Over 180,000 served.
But there was disunity on both sides.
High disunity. You had the NYC draft riots fueled by class tensions in the North and the Richmond bread riots in the Confederacy due to economic strain.
The war concluded with Reconstruction.
And the 3 constitutional amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, provided the legal and constitutional basis for full equality.
Abolished slavery, granted citizenship and equal protection, and granted black male suffrage.
These are the most critical pieces of legislation from this entire period.
However, the promise of equality failed. Why?
Because the entrenched Southern economic structure land ownership remained largely with former planters.
And there was violent resistance. Black codes restricted the rights of freedmen. The KKK used intimidation and violence.
And critically, the convict leasing system emerged. This was slavery under another name.
Where local authorities would arrest newly freed black men on petty charges and lease their labor out for profit, maintaining the old economic hierarchy.
Right, and the federal government further rolled back rights. Supreme Court decisions like the Slaughterhouse cases and United States v. Cruikshank narrowed the application of the 14th Amendment's protection.
Which drastically weakened the federal government's enforcement powers.
And Reconstruction officially ended with the Compromise of 1877, where federal troops were removed from the South in exchange for Rutherford B. Hayes's presidency.
Abandoning federal protection for black Southerners.
Exactly.
Okay, welcome to the Gilded Age, period 6, 1865 to 1898.
A period characterized by explosive industrial transformation, massive wealth concentration, and political corruption, all beneath a thin layer of prosperity.
So the rise of industrial capitalism was driven by what?
Technological advances, the Bessemer process for cheap steel, the spread of oil and electricity provided by Thomas Edison.
And critically, pro-growth government policies, particularly laissez-faire capitalism.
The idea that the market should be unregulated, this provided the ideological environment for massive corporations to flourish.
And business consolidation strategies are vital for understanding the wealth gap.
You have to know the 2 main ones. Andrew Carnegie utilized vertical integration, controlling every stage of steel production from raw materials to distribution.
And John D. Rockefeller pioneered horizontal integration.
Consolidating competing oil refineries into trusts and holding companies like Standard Oil gaining monopoly power.
Ideologically, this wealth was justified by 2 opposing viewpoints.
On one hand, you have social Darwinism, championed by William Graham Sumner. He argued that wealth was proof of survival of the fittest and that government interference was detrimental.
And on the other hand,
Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, which argued that the wealthy had a moral duty to redistribute wealth through philanthropy funding libraries, universities, which justified the accumulation of that wealth in the first place.
but this system resulted in massive inequality and exploitation.
The workforce faced long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions, leading to the rise of organized labor.
And you must contrast the 2 major union types. First, the Knights of Labor.
They were inclusive, welcoming skilled, unskilled women and black workers. They sought broad social change like the 8-hour day and the destruction of monopolies.
In contrast, the American Federation of Labor, AFL, led by Samuel Gompers.
They focused only on skilled craft workers and pursued narrow, practical economic goals: higher wages, shorter hours, and better safety.
And throughout this period, the government consistently sided with corporations.
Consistently, using federal troops to crush the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, allowing the collapse of the Knights of Labor after the Haymarket Affair, and aggressively intervening to end the Pullman Strike in 1894.
Concurrently, the last West was settled rapidly.
Driven by the Homestead Act offering 160 acres of free land and the Pacific Railroads Acts, which were heavily subsidized by the government.
And the invention of barbed wire by Joseph Glidden effectively ended the open range system for cattle ranching.
But this expansion led to severe conflict and conquest. The intentional disruption of the American bison population was devastating.
It undermined Plains Indian culture and forced dependence on government rations.
The U.S. government violated treaties and responded to resistance with force, culminating in the Wounded Knee Massacre,
Assimilation was the official goal.
epitomized by the Carlisle Indian Industrial School's motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Just brutal.
The late 19th century also saw massive demographic shifts due to new immigrants.
Arriving from southern and eastern Europe and Asia, living in ethnic enclaves like Little Italy and Chinatown, and providing the essential, cheap labor for industrial expansion.
And this influx fueled a nativist backlash.
Driven by cultural anxiety, fear of race suicide, stoked by figures like Henry Cabot Lodge, and economic fears that immigrants were driving down wages.
And this anxiety was codified into law with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
The first federal law targeting a specific nationality, and the Contract Labor Law of 1885.
But on the reform side, figures like Jane Addams established settlement houses.
Most famously, Hull House, providing essential social services and promoting assimilation for immigrant families.
Politics during the Gilded Age was defined by corruption.
The spoils system rewarding political supporters with government jobs led to the assassination of President Garfield and the subsequent passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883.
And political machines, like Tammany Hall, thrived by providing necessary services to immigrants in exchange for political loyalty and votes.
The farmers' response to exploitation by railroads and trusts was populism.
They demanded change because overproduction led to low prices, and they were charged exorbitant rates by the railroads.
So the Populist Party's Omaha platform demanded radical federal action. Free coinage of silver to increase the money supply, nationalization of railroads, and a graduated income tax.
But government regulation was anemic.
Very weak. The Interstate Commerce Act created the ICC to regulate railroad rates, but lacked enforcement power. The Sherman Antitrust Act was intended to break up monopolies, but was, ironically, used more frequently against labor unions at first.
Finally, the New South.
Despite calls for industrialization, the economic reality was the continuity of sharecropping and tenant farming, which trapped former slaves and poor whites in cycles of debt.
Jim Crow laws and disenfranchisement through poll taxes and literacy tests were codified.
And this segregation was legally ratified by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which established the separate but equal doctrine.
African-American responses included Ida B. Wells's powerful anti-lynching campaigns.
And Booker T. Washington's focus on vocational training and economic uplift through the Atlanta Compromise.
We transitioned into Period 7, 1890-1945. This covers American imperialism, the Progressive Era, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression.
A period of intense global and domestic crisis.
It begins with the rise of imperialism. What were the motivations?
Primarily economic. The need for new global markets to absorb surplus industrial and agricultural goods, and ideological.
The Frontier Thesis by Frederick Jackson Turner argued that expansion was central to the American identity,
suggesting that if there was no internal frontier, America must seek new frontiers abroad.
And the ideological justification came from social Darwinism, the concept of the white man's burden, and a belief in Anglo-Saxon racial superiority.
The catalyst was the Spanish-American War. Yellow journalism, led by Pulitzer and Hearst, sensationalized Spanish atrocities in Cuba.
And the explosion of the USS Maine provided the immediate trigger.
So the 1898 Treaty of Paris secured major acquisitions. The Philippines, which sparked the subsequent Philippine-American War and resistance.
Puerto Rico and Guam. And Hawaii was annexed the same year.
Right. And U.S. foreign policy shifted. We asserted control over Cuba through the Platt Amendment and pursued the open-door policy in China to ensure equal trading rights, cementing U.S. influence in Asia.
Next, the Progressive Era. What was the core belief?
The core belief was that government action led by expert investigation could fix the massive social and economic problems created by Gilded Age industrialization and corruption.
The strategies included muckraking like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, exposing meatpacking conditions, and democratic reforms like the initiative, referendum, and recall.
And this era saw major changes to the constitutional structure. You must remember the progressive amendments.
The 16th income tax, 17th direct election of senators, 18th prohibition, and 19th women's suffrage.
Exactly. The reforms ranged from scientific management aimed at efficiency to grassroots activism. However, progressives critically failed to challenge systemic racial injustice, allowing Plessy to remain law.
World War I pulled the U.S. definitively onto the global stage.
Causes for entry included Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram. Wilson framed the entry ideologically, making the world safe for democracy.
The home front saw massive federal power expansion and severe suppression of dissent.
The Espionage Act and Sedition Act led to the Supreme Court ruling in Schenck v. United States, establishing the clear and present danger test for restricting free speech.
This fueled the first Red Scare and the subsequent Palmer raids targeting suspected radicals.
The war also dramatically accelerated the Great Migration.
As African Americans fled the push factors of the Jim Crow South for the pull factors of wartime labor shortages in northern cities.
This population shift led to severe racial tensions and violence, exemplified by the Red Summer of 1919 and the Tulsa Massacre of 1921.
And post-war, the U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations.
Marking a return to political isolationism.
The Roaring Twenties were defined by mass production.
Henry Ford's assembly line made the Model T affordable, creating a massive new consumer base. Scientific management, or Taylorism, increased efficiency.
This spurred a new consumer culture, driven by mass media like radio and movies, that created a shared national culture.
But this cultural shift triggered intense backlash. You had the conflict between modernism and fundamentalism, highlighted by the Scopes trial.
Nativism culminated in the National Origins Act of 1924, which drastically cut Southern and Eastern European immigration.
And amid this, the Harlem Renaissance celebrated Black cultural and artistic expression in response to exclusion.
Then came the Great Depression. What were the causes?
Structural economic fragility, crippling farm debt, highly uneven wealth distribution. The top 5% held most of the wealth, and the stock market crash.
President Hoover's reliance on voluntary cooperation utterly failed, symbolized by the proliferation of Hoovervilles.
So Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal was a radical departure, utilizing government power for relief, recovery, and reform.
This expanded the federal role dramatically. Key programs include the FDIC, the CCC, the TVA,
and the Social Security Act, which created the foundation for the modern welfare state.
The New Deal redefined liberalism as a belief that government action was necessary to ensure economic stability and individual security.
And it created a powerful new political alignment, bringing ethnic groups, African Americans, and the working class into the Democratic Party coalition for decades.
World War II cemented the U.S. as a global superpower.
Mobilization required massive federal policy intervention. Executive Order 8802 banned defense discrimination. The Bracero program brought Mexican laborers, and Rosie the Riveter symbolized women entering the defense workforce.
The war was framed as a moral struggle against fascism.
Defined by Norman Rockwell's four freedoms: freedom of speech, worship, from want, and from fear.
The military effort was successful thanks to Allied cooperation and key contributions from minorities like the Tuskegee Airmen and Code Talkers.
And the use of atomic bombs hastened the end, leaving the U.S. with an intact industrial base, ready for global leadership.
The post-war foundation was immediately set. The UN was established, the Marshall Plan aimed to rebuild Europe.
And the ideological divide with the USSR led to the start of the Cold War.
All right, period 8, 1945-1980. This is the Cold War era.
A period of massive economic boom and suburban conformity, running alongside revolutionary civil rights and countercultural movements.
U.S. foreign policy was dominated by containment.
The strategy of preventing the spread of communism. Key policies include the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO.
This led to proxy conflicts like the Korean War.
Right, and the arms race, based on the terrifying logic of mutually assured destruction, MAD, eventually shifted toward détente under Nixon, which led to the SALT Treaty.
Domestically, the Cold War fueled the Second Red Scare.
McCarthyism, loyalty programs, and HUAC investigations like the Hollywood 10 created a climate of widespread fear and conformity.
The execution of the Rosenbergs intensified spy fears.
And even Eisenhower, in his farewell address, warned the nation about the undue influence of the military-industrial complex on policy.
Post-war America experienced an unparalleled economic boom.
Fueled by federal policy. The GI Bill provided unprecedented education and home loans. The Interstate Highway Act spurred massive suburbanization.
And the baby boom stimulated consumer demand for decades.
This prosperity fostered conformity, reinforced by mass media like television, which promoted traditional gender roles.
But critique came from the beat movement Kerouac, Ginsberg, and writers like Salinger.
And rock and roll, with Elvis and Chuck Berry, challenged established cultural norms and racial barriers.
However, this prosperity was not equally shared.
Not at all. Structural inequality was institutionalized through redlining, where FHA and HOLC loans excluded minorities from purchasing homes in white neighborhoods.
Which institutionalized segregation and a massive racial wealth disparity.
And this, combined with climate and defense jobs, fueled massive migration to the Sun Belt, the South and West, causing a significant political power shift.
The civil rights movement transformed the nation.
The legal foundation was laid by Thurgood Marshall's NAACP strategy, culminating in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which overturned Plessy.
But grassroots activism was key.
The Montgomery bus boycott, using economic leverage, and MLK's nonviolent resistance created national sympathy, leading to landmark legislation.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society aimed to eliminate poverty and racial discrimination, establishing programs like Medicare and Medicaid.
And the liberal Warren Court expanded individual rights, notably in Gideon v. Wainwright and Griswold v. Connecticut.
And on immigration, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 abolished the discriminatory national origin quotas, fundamentally reshaping American demographics.
So that brings us to a crucial point of tension. If the Great Society was so effective, why did the conservative backlash of the 1970s gain so much traction?
The Vietnam War is a huge part of the answer. The initial intervention, justified by the domino theory, escalated with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
But the Tet Offensive in 1968 exposed U.S. vulnerability.
And it fueled the credibility gap between what the government claimed and what the public saw.
The massive anti-war movement and the revelations of the Pentagon Papers destroyed public trust,
leading to the War Powers Act of 1973, which limited presidential authority.
The 1970s brought new crises that further eroded trust.
Right. This is where you must understand stagflation.
The simultaneous occurrence of high inflation and high unemployment, which fundamentally defied traditional Keynesian economics.
And this was exacerbated by the energy crises from the OPEC embargo and the Iranian Revolution.
So these crises, economic failure, foreign policy failure, and the Watergate scandal fueled the conservative challenge.
The New Right, a movement energized by Barry Goldwater's earlier campaign and the rise of the religious right or moral majority.
And they mobilized against the social changes of the 1960s, specifically opposing abortion and the Equal Rights Amendment.
And that set the stage for the 80s.
We wrap up with Period 9, 1980, to the present. The central themes are the conservative resurgence, the end of the Cold War, and the challenges of globalization and technology.
And the Reagan Revolution was a direct political reaction against the crises of the 1970s and the expansion of the New Deal and Great Society.
Reaganomics, or supply-side economics, implemented massive tax cuts,
particularly through the Economic Recovery Act of 1981 and widespread deregulation.
The premise, often called trickle-down, was that tax cuts for the wealthy would spur investment, benefiting everyone.
And the results were undeniable economic growth, but also a massive national debt fueled by military spending and soaring income inequality.
Social conservatism, solidified through the moral majority, driving culture wars and leading to judicial appointments that began scaling back affirmative action.
Reagan also pursued an assertive foreign policy, labeling the USSR the evil empire and launching a massive military buildup,
including the highly expensive Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or Star Wars.
And this economic and technological pressure, coupled with diplomatic initiatives with Gorbachev, led to the Cold War's conclusion around 1991.
The post-Cold War world was defined by U.S. unipolar dominance.
Focus shifted to economic engagement, like with APEC, and interventionism, like in Panama.
This environment facilitated the globalized economy.
The American workforce saw a sharp decline in manufacturing, the Rust Belt deindustrialization, and a massive rise in the service sector.
Globalization, driven by outsourcing and free trade agreements like JTT, intensified competition and contributed to wage stagnation for many domestic workers.
And the continued ascendancy of the Sun Belt, with new tech hubs like Silicon Valley, reinforced the political realignment toward the GOP.
Finally, the 21st century challenges, defined acutely by the September 11, 2001 attacks,
which resulted in nearly 3,000 deaths and national shock.
This led to the War on Terror.
The invasion of Afghanistan because the Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden, and the controversial invasion of Iraq in 2003 based on alleged WMDs and 9/11 links that were later disproven.
This era marked a dramatic foreign policy shift
toward preemptive and preventive warfare. And concurrent demographic shifts saw continued high immigration growth, particularly from Asia and Latin America.
which increased cultural influence and required educational adaptation across the country.
And that brings us to today.
We just completed an intense marathon, traveling from indigenous adaptation in 1491 straight through to the challenges of the 21st century.
We did.
And if you look back, the historical themes are starkly persistent and crucial for your FRQs.
Think about the immense continuity of the racial struggle. From the 13th Amendment's promise, through the betrayal of Jim Crow, the trauma of convict leasing, and finally to the legislative achievements of the Civil Rights Act.
The struggle for full equality is the central, enduring thread of American history.
It is. And similarly, the persistent debate over the proper role of the federal government runs from Hamilton's National Bank through Jackson's vetoes, the New Deal's expanded welfare state, and Reaganomics' attempts to roll it back.
So you now possess the complete chronological framework and the critical details, the names, laws, and events needed for nuanced FRQ answers.
You understand causation, comparison, and the enduring tension between American ideals of liberty and equality and the historical reality of persistent inequality and conflict.
Lock those details in your mind tonight.
Our final provocative thought for you to consider is this. The biggest continuity we observed is the debate over the balance between individual liberty and federal power, a debate present in every single period since 1787.
So how will the challenges of the 21st century, particularly related to the massive power of technology companies, artificial intelligence, and global supply chain vulnerabilities, force a new, definitive answer to that central question about federal authority in the decades ahead?
Good luck on your exam tomorrow. You've got this.